Louis XVIII, known as the Desired, was a monarch of the House of Bourbon who ruled as King of France from 1814 to 1824 except for a period in 1815 known as the 100 Days. Louis XVIII spent 23 years in exile, from 1791 to 1814, during the French Revolution and the First French Empire, and again in 1815. During the period of the 100 Days, upon the return of Napoleon I from Elba, until his accession to the throne of France, Louis held the title of Count of Provence's brother of King Louis XVI. On 21 September 1792, the National Convention abolished the monarchy and deposed King Louis XVI, who was later executed by guillotine. When the young Louis XVII, Louis XVI's son, died in prison in June 1795, Louis XVIII succeeded his nephew as titular king. During the French Revolution and Napoleonic era, Louis XVIII lived in exile in Prussia, the United Kingdom and Russia. When the Sixth Coalition finally defeated Napoleon in 1814, Louis was placed in what he, and the French royalists, considered his rightful position. Napoleon escaped from his exile in Elba, however, and restored his French Empire. Louis XVIII fled and a Seventh Coalition declared war on the French Empire, defeated Napoleon, and restored Louis XVIII to the French throne. Louis XVIII ruled as king for slightly less than a decade. The Bourbon Restoration regime was a constitutional monarchy. As a constitutional monarch, Louis XVIII's royal prerogative was reduced substantially by the Charter of 1814, France's new constitution. Louis had no children, therefore, upon his death, the crown passed to his brother, Charles, Count of Artois. Louis XVIII was the last French monarch to die while reigning. As his successor, Charles X abdicated, Louis Philippe and Napoleon III were deposed. Youth. Louis Stanislas Xavier, styled Count of Provence from birth, was born on 17 November 1755 in the Palace of Versailles, the son of Louis, Dauphin of France, and his wife Maria Josepha of Saxony. He was the grandson of the reigning King Louis XV. As a son of the Dauphin, he was a fils de France. Louis Stanislas was christened Louis Stanislas Xavier 6 months after his birth in accordance with Bourbon family tradition, being nameless before his baptism. By this act, he became also a Knight of the Order of the Holy Spirit. The name of Louis was bestowed because it was typical of a prince of France. Stanislas was chosen to honor his great-grandfather King Stanislaw I of Poland, and Xavier was chosen for Saint Francis Xavier, whom his mother's family held as one of their patron saints. At the time of his birth, Louis Stanislas was fourth in line to the throne of France, behind his father and his two elder brothers, Louis Joseph Xavier, Duke of Burgundy, and Louis Auguste, Duke of Berry. The former died in 1761, leaving Louis Auguste as heir apparent until the Dauphin's own premature death in 1765. The two deaths elevated Louis Stanislas to second in the line of succession, while Louis Auguste acquired the title Dauphin. Louis Stanislas found comfort in his governess, Madame de Marsan, governess of the children of France, as he was her favorite among his siblings. Louis Stanislas was taken away from his governess when he turned 7, the age at which the education of boys of royal blood and of the nobility was turned over to men. Antoine de Quellin d'Ester de Corzet, Duke of Lefèvre, a friend of his father, was named his governor. Louis Stanislas was an intelligent boy, excelling in classics. His education was of the same quality and consistency as that of his older brother, Louis Auguste, despite the fact that Louis Auguste was heir and Louis Stanislas was not. Louis Stanislas' education was quite religious in nature. Several of his teachers were men of the cloth. Lefèvre drilled into young Louis Stanislas and his brothers the way he thought princes should know how to withdraw themselves, to like to work, and to know how to reason correctly. In April 1771, Louis Stanislas' education was formally concluded and his own independent household was established, which astounded contemporaries with its extravagance. In 1773, the number of servants reached 390. In the same month his household was founded, Louis was granted several titles by his grandfather, Louis XV. Duke of Anjou, Count of Maine, Count of Perche, and Count of Seigneuries. During this period of his life he was often known by the title Count of Provence. On 17 December 1773, he was ordained as a Grand Master of the Order of St. Lazarus. Marriage. On 14 May 1771, Louis Stanislas married Princess Maria Josephina of Savoy. Marie Josephine was a daughter of Victor Amadeus, Duke of Savoy, and his wife Maria Antonia Ferdinanda of Spain. A luxurious ball followed the wedding on 20 May. Louis Stanislas was repulsed by his wife, who was considered ugly, tedious, and ignorant of the customs of the court of Versailles. The marriage remained unconsummated for years. Biographers disagree about the reason. The most common theories propose Louis Stanislas' alleged impotence or his unwillingness to sleep with his wife due to her poor personal hygiene. She never brushed her teeth, plucked her eyebrows, or used any perfumes. At the time of his marriage, Louis Stanislas was obese and waddled instead of walked. He never exercised and continued to eat enormous amounts of food. Despite the fact that Louis Stanislas was not infatuated with his wife, he boasted that the two enjoyed vigorous conjugal relations, but such declarations were held in low esteem by courtiers at Versailles. He also proclaimed his wife to be pregnant merely to spite Louis Auguste and his wife Marie Antoinette, who had not yet consummated their marriage. The Dauphin and Louis Stanislas did not enjoy a harmonious relationship and often quarreled, as did their wives. Louis Stanislas did impregnate his wife in 1774, having conquered his aversion. However, the pregnancy ended in a miscarriage. A second pregnancy in 1781 also miscarried, and the marriage remained childless. At his brother's court, on 27 April 1774, Louis XV fell ill after contracting smallpox and died the following 10 May. The Dauphin, Louis Auguste, succeeded his grandfather as King Louis XVI. As eldest brother of the king, Louis Stanislas received the title Monsieur. Louis Stanislas longed for political influence. He attempted to gain admittance to the King's Council in 1774, but failed. Louis Stanislas was left in a political limbo that he called a gap of 12 years in my political life. Louis XVI granted Louis Stanislas revenues from the Duchy of Alençon in December 1774. The duchy was given to enhance Louis Stanislas' prestige. However, the appanage generated only 300,000 livres per annum, an amount much lower than it had been at its peak in the 14th century. Louis Stanislas traveled more through France than other members of the royal family, who rarely left the Ile-de-France. In 1774, he accompanied his sister Clotilde to Chambéry on the journey to meet her bridegroom Charles Emmanuel, Prince of Piedmont, heir to the throne of Sardinia. In 1775, he visited Lyon and also his spinster aunts Adélaide and Victoire while they were taking the waters at Vichy. The 4 provincial tours that Louis Stanislas took before the year 1791 amounted to a total of 3 months. On 5 May 1778, Dr. Lasson, Marie Antoinette's private physician, confirmed her pregnancy. The birth of a girl came as a relief to the Count of Provence, who kept his position as heir to Louis XVI, since Salic law excluded women from acceding to the throne of France. However, Louis Stanislas did not remain heir to the throne much longer. On the 22nd of October 1781, Marie Antoinette gave birth to the Dauphin Louis Joseph. Louis Stanislas and his brother, the Count of Artois, served as godfathers by proxy for Joseph II, Holy Roman Emperor, the Queen's brother. When Marie Antoinette gave birth to her second son, Louis Charles, in March 1785, Louis Stanislas slid further down the line of succession. In 1780, Anne Nompard de Caumont, Countess of Balbire, entered the service of Marie Josephine. Louis Stanislas soon fell in love with his wife's new lady-in-waiting and installed her as his mistress, which resulted in the couple's already small affection for each other cooling entirely. Louis Stanislas commissioned a pavilion for his mistress on a parcel that became known as the Parc Balbire at Versailles. Louis Stanislas lived a quiet and sedentary lifestyle at this point, not having a great deal to do since his self-proclaimed political exclusion in 1774. He kept himself occupied with his vast library of over 11,000 books at Balbire's pavilion, reading for several hours each morning. In the early 1780s, he also incurred huge debts totaling 10 million livres, which his brother Louis XVI paid. An assembly of notables was convened in February 1787 to ratify the financial reform sought by the Comptroller General of Finance Charles Alexandre de Quilon. This provided the Count of Provence, who abhorred the radical reforms proposed by Quilon, the opportunity he had long been waiting for to establish himself in politics. The reforms proposed a new property tax, and new elected provincial assemblies that would have a say in local taxation. Quilon's proposition was rejected outright by the notables, and, as a result, Louis XVI dismissed him. The Archbishop of Toulouse, Étienne Charles de la Menie de Brienne, acquired Quilon's ministry. Brienne attempted to salvage Quilon's reforms, but ultimately failed to convince the notables to approve them. A frustrated Louis XVI dissolved the assembly. Brienne's reforms were then submitted to the Parlement of Paris in the hopes that they would be approved. The Parlement of Paris refused to accept Brienne's proposals and pronounced that any new taxation would have to be approved by an Estates General. Louis XVI and Brienne took a hostile stance against this rejection, and Louis XVI had to implement a bed of justice, which automatically registered an edict in the Parlement of Paris to ratify the desired reforms. On the 8th of May, two of the leading members of the Parlement of Paris were arrested. There was rioting in Brittany, Provence, Burgundy and Bayeux in reaction to their arrest. This unrest was engineered by local magistrates and nobles, who enticed the people to revolt against the Lit de Justice, which was quite unfavorable to the nobles and magistrates. The clergy also joined the provincial cause, and condemned Brienne's tax reforms. Brienne conceded defeat in July and agreed to calling the Estates General to meet in 1789. He resigned from his post in August and was replaced by the Swiss magnate Jacques Necker. In November 1788, a second assembly of notables was convened by Jacques Necker to consider the makeup of the next Estates General. The Parlement de Paris recommended that the estates should be the same as they were at the last assembly, in 1614. The notables rejected the dual representation proposal. Louis Stanislas was the only notable to vote to increase the size of the Third Estate. Necker disregarded the notables' judgment, and convinced Louis XVI to grant the extra representation. Louis duly obliged on the 27th of December. The outbreak of the French Revolution. The Estates General were convened in May 1789 to ratify financial reforms. The Count of Provence favoured a stalwart position against the Third Estate and its demands for tax reform. On the 17th of June, the Third Estate declared itself a National Assembly, an assembly not of the estates, but of the people. Provence urged the king to act strongly against the declaration, while the king's popular minister Jacques Necker intended to compromise with the new assembly. Louis XVI was characteristically indecisive. On the 9th of July, the assembly declared itself a national constituent assembly that would give France a constitution. On the 11th of July, Louis XVI dismissed Necker, which led to widespread rioting across Paris. On the 12th of July, the sabre charge of the cavalry regiment of Charles-Eugène de Lorraine, Prince de Lamasque, on a crowd gathered at the Tuileries Gardens, sparked the storming of the Bastille 2 days later. On the 16th of July, the Count of Artois left France with his wife and children, along with many other courtiers. Artois and his family took up residence in Turin, the capital city of his father-in-law's Kingdom of Sardinia, with the family of the Princes of Condé. The Count of Provence decided to remain at Versailles. When the royal family plotted to abscond from Versailles to Metz, Provence advised the king not to leave, a suggestion he accepted. The royal family was forced to leave the palace at Versailles on the day after the Women's March on Versailles, the 5th of October 1789. They were relocated to Paris. There, the Count of Provence and his wife lodged in the Luxembourg Palace, while the rest of the royal family stayed in the Tuileries Palace. In March 1791, the National Assembly created a law outlining the regency of Louis Charles in case his father died while he was still too young to reign. This law awarded the regency to Louis Charles's nearest male relative in France, and after him, the Duke of Orléans. If Orléans were unavailable, the regency would be submitted to election. The Count of Provence and his wife fled to the Austrian Netherlands in conjunction with the royal family's failed flight to Varennes in June 1791.